Alice? Alrighty, hello to everyone joining us on Zoom. Alrighty. We get to where we left off and we'll start from there. Okay. Alrighty, so just a couple quick things. One is that spring break is next week. I don't think I need to announce that, but just in case anybody forgot. We do have class on Thursday. I know that traditionally people start spring break earlier and earlier every year. We will be talking about PTSD, so please do try to be here. I think if there's anything else I need to remind y'all of, exam 2 is not till after spring break. The media project paper is coming up due in about a month, so don't let that slip off your radar. I posted the groups. If for some reason I have inadvertently put you with your worst enemy or your ex or something along those lines, you can just send me a nice little email. No one has to know why I switch you between groups. So I'm just going to take a quick sec here to take attendance both on Zoom and in person, and then we'll go ahead and get started. And there may be people who fell in a little late because I know that the International Women's Day event was running a little over. There were some technical issues, so. Alrighty. Okay, so we were talking about social anxiety, and we've gotten to the point of talking about treatments for social anxiety. So in terms of psychological treatment, not surprisingly, because I'm bringing it up a lot, CBT works very well for sociophobia. In particular, exposures for social anxiety include having your client talk to people. So when I was our assistant clinic director, for example, social anxiety clients would be assigned to come talk to me because I was fairly non-threatening, right? And a nice person who also has therapeutic background. So we would, they would do a practice conversation with me or with a really nice administrative assistant. So that's an option. I had another person in the clinic who their exposure was they walked across campus together in between classes. And she got her client to say hi to people as they walked past. So that can be really helpful. Rehearsal and role play. The client place themselves. The therapist pretends to play, someone hostile, a boss. Even sometimes if it's very severe social anxiety, the retail clerk you're going to check out with, right? Things like that. And it's highly effective. In terms of medication, a lot of the things we've already talked about for other types of anxiety, perhaps not surprisingly, beta blockers don't work. They're ineffective, but tricyclic antidepressants, MAOIs reduce social anxiety. SSRIs like Paxil are FDA approved for the treatment of social anxiety disorder. However, like other anxiety disorders, if you stop taking the medication, relapse rates are high. Basically, medications don't give you the tools to succeed after you're done with them, whereas therapy does. So if you finish therapy, you've gained some skills you continue to use outside of therapy. Alrighty, so next we have a little video about panic, which I thought was interesting to watch before we dive into the symptoms.
And next tonight, something different. Imagine millions of people watch your life come unglued. An all-out panic attack on TV. It happened to our Dan Harris, but his journey of discovery brought back some lessons for all of us about our lives too, and he's telling us about it tonight, Dan.
Hi, Dan. This is a very personal story, as you know, because you were right there when it all started. Sometimes there are things holding us back from being happy, and we're not aware of it until life hits us over the head with a frying pan. And that is what happened to me.
From ABC News, this is Good Morning America.
Welcome to the most embarrassing day of my life.
We're going to go now to Dan Harris, who's at the news desk. Dan.
Good morning, Charlie and Diane. Thank you. This is me 10 years ago. And the reason this is the most embarrassing day of my life is not that it looks like I've been attacked by a blow dryer and a can of hairspray. No, it's that I am about to freak out on national television. Health news now. One of the world's most commonly prescribed medications may be providing a big bonus. Researchers report people who take cholesterol-lowering drugs called statins for at least 5 years may also lower their risk for cancer. But it's too early to prescribe statins slowly for cancer production. At this point, I realize I'm helpless, so I bail right in the middle. That does it for news. We're going to go back now to Robin and Charlie.
All right, thanks very much, Dan Harris at the news desk with some of the headlines of the morning. Want to go to Tony Perkins now.
Once the fear subsided, humiliation rushed in. I knew with rock-solid certainty that I had just had a panic attack on national television. So why would I tell you this very embarrassing story? Because that on-air meltdown was the culmination of something that had been building for years, something I never stopped to address. It's something we all battle, whether we have panic attacks or not. Call it the voice in your head.
That's where I feel stress or when
it's the inner narrator that can control us.
Highly critical.
Get in the way of living the life we want to lead. For Brian Simmons, it was outbursts of anger.
I would act very reactively, very
For Becky Schmitz, it was emotional eating.
Eating was like my security blanket.
And for a young Dr. Mehmet Oz, it was a racing mind that kept him from focusing on one thing at a time.
For me, saying a voice in the head is too benign an expression of what really happens. That massive cacophony that we hear, deafeningly loud.
Does it surprise you at all how much time we all spend fixating on these self-defeating voices we hear?
I have always been surprised how much time we spend wasting on the voices in our head telling us we're not good enough.
In my case, like many Americans, my inner voice was pushing me to succeed. Annual New Year's party in New York. This is me in my late 20s.
Thank you, Dan. Dan Harris.
I had my dream job, but I also had doubts about whether I was good enough. But it's hard to do that. All right, I'm going to try it. 3, 2, 1. My solution? Become a workaholic. After 9/11, I volunteered to spend years in war zones where I covered the heroics of our men and women overseas and got a real taste of both the horror and the adrenaline of combat. After years of always barreling forward, when I finally slowed down, it was as if my mind revolted and I got depressed. And so, in my free time, I briefly but stupidly began self-medicating. And it was those recreational drugs, my doctor would later tell me, that almost certainly produced the on-air panic attack. But losing it in front of 5 million people became a turning point. It set me off on a strange, unplanned odyssey, the kind of search so many of us embark upon for.
And next
so
tonight.
he has his like happy shiny story, but I show that just because I wanted you all to see that like panic doesn't have to look obvious, right? Like he was having a panic attack. He covered it really well. The only way you could really tell was his breath went, right? So it can definitely be something that we see. Yeah. I don't. I'm sure we could Google it. I'm not sure. But essentially, in general, if you try to self-medicate or something that's not actually like structured to treat something, it can just mask the symptoms and then they pop out in really inopportune times. So, you know, he probably couldn't take the recreational drugs when he was on the air, or maybe he did and that caused it, I'm not sure, but the symptoms come out, right? And I think I told you all this before, that like when I was at the VA in 2009, there were people from like 1970 coming in for PTSD because they'd been just in a stupor of alcoholism since then. And when they got that treated, all their PTSD symptoms from Vietnam came out, right? And so, yeah, like they can seem like they're fixing things, but they're really just masking it. Yeah, that's such a good point. It'd be interesting to Google. I'm not sure. I was just sort of looking for new videos and stumbled across this one. And I was like, huh. Or maybe he doesn't say. I don't know. Maybe he thinks if he doesn't say, he doesn't get arrested. I don't know. Fair. So you do not have to have panic disorder to have a panic attack. And in fact, a decent number of adults will experience a panic attack without ever being diagnosed with panic disorder. So you have this abrupt surge in fear or discomfort that peaks within minutes, just quick onset, shoots right up. And you've got to have at least 4 of these symptoms. So pounding heart, sweating, shaking, shortness of breath, choking, chest pain, nausea, dizziness, chills or heat sensations. So just taking those before I get to the more psychological ones, if someone told you they had those symptoms, what would you think was going on with them? Racing heart, sweating, pounding, chest pain. What's that? It could be. Let's think physical. Yeah. Heart attack, right? So people will often think they're having a heart attack when they have a panic attack. And that's obviously going to make your panic attack worse, right? Because it's really scary to think you're going to have a heart attack. People survive them, but some people don't, right? And they'll even, and I have this on the next slides, they'll even go to the ER thinking they have panic attack or they're having a heart attack. Paresthesias are numbness in your external limbs. And that's part of the fight or flight response that's sort of diverting blood to the major muscles of your body. Derealization or depersonalization is a sense of like not being connected to yourself or feeling like you're not quite in the world. Feeling a loss of control, or they're going crazy, or fear of dying. So about 90% of people who have a panic attack show up in the ER thinking they've had a heart attack. And, or they think maybe it's like a neurological or respiratory issue. So they can be improperly diagnosed, right, as some sort of medical disorder, and it can honestly take years for someone to recognize, oh, what you're having is a panic attack. And obviously, we do not want medical professionals to just assume every heart attack is a panic attack, right? And in fact, unfortunately, they do that more so for certain groups than for others, unfortunately. But at the same token, we need to be more psychologically minded in our medical care so that we can at least rule this out when things are going down. So panic disorder is when you have recurrent panic attacks. And then you have a month or more of essentially worrying you're going to have more panic attacks. And so you'll change your behavior to avoid having panic attacks. So the triggers of panic attacks are things like your internal heart rate going up, your breathing increasing. And it can be outside things for people as well. And so what people will do is they'll stop exercising, they'll stop being intimate with their partners, because those symptoms bring that up, right? Those activities raise your heart rate, give you those things. The really interesting thing about panic, and I'll back up 2 slides so we can look at those symptoms again, is these are all actually symptoms of the fight or flight response. So you're breathing more quickly, your heart is pounding so that you can get oxygen into your blood and circulate it throughout your body. Ironically, your body actually slows down the flow of blood to your brain because it doesn't want you to overthink. So that's why you feel dizziness or derealization. I mentioned the tingling from that. The nausea is actually because your body will shut down digestion. Like, we don't need to digest this food now, we can do that later. And then you keep going. So one of the things we do in therapy for people with panic attacks is explain that to them. Explain this is your body overreacting. All right, and this video explains what a panic attack is like to experience.
I thought I was having a medical emergency. I was really dizzy. I was always really worried that I was going to faint. The heart palpitations, the sweaty palms. I felt like I wasn't real. I remember going downstairs into the foyer of the office building, and I just felt like my legs weren't there anymore. I was shaking just uncontrollably. But I guess you were just walking past, you probably would have just seen someone standing in the foyer. I had always wanted to move to London. It was the rite of passage for Kiwis to move overseas. I had quite high expectations, both from a job perspective, but also from a lifestyle perspective. I got offered quite a good job at a global corporation over there, and then the global financial crisis had really started to take hold, and the offer actually got retracted. I felt really embarrassed because all of my friends all had really good jobs. I felt like a failure, and I put so much pressure on myself that my physical health by that point was really poor. I found really hard to get out of bed, and that didn't really change once I got a job either. I was still really despondent, really disappointed in myself, and really unsure about how to sort of pick myself up. I had been having panic attacks without realising it for a number of months. I was Googling and I came across this anxiety website. I remember clicking on the link and it just came up with literally dozens of physical symptoms. You see them and you're like, did I have all of this? And I realised that I really had to do something to look after myself and to be able to start to enjoy the life that I should have been able to have. I eventually went to a GP in London. It was the best thing I could have done. I was diagnosed with generalised anxiety disorder, panic disorder, depression, and health anxiety as well. Once I had been officially diagnosed, I think that in itself was a huge weight lifted.
So she's going to talk about how great that is, which is great. But I just wanted you all to get the vibe. And if you all need to close those windows, feel free. I notice you're getting like gusts over there. So yeah, so she is talking about, she didn't even realize that all these physical symptoms could mean it was actually anxiety, right? One of the other things I think that's really important to look at is, you know, what's anxiety, what's panic, what's that phobic fear response? So panic, again, is this really abrupt onset. It reaches its max intensity within 10 minutes, subsides within 20 to 30 minutes. Anxiety, however, is long lasting, no abrupt onset, and it's not as intense. Panic usually doesn't have an identifiable trigger. Again, you can start to, in therapy, nail it down as to, oh, it's something internal or something external going on, maybe both. But phobic fear, you know what that trigger is. You know, I'm afraid of heights, I'm afraid of snakes. It's really clear to you. And so this is Erin and Judy Beck talking about the difference between specific phobia and panic disorder.
There's an important distinction between phobia and panic disorder. So someone who has an airplane phobia is generally afraid that the airplane is going to crash. The person who has panic disorder and has panic attacks in the airplane is usually more afraid that he will get so anxious that he will go crazy in the airplane.
That's right. That's right. That was so you can have the fear of suffocation.
Yeah,
was the one thing that gave her the panic attack. Then I had another patient who he had to sit in the first row and had to be right on the aisle with the idea that somehow or other he could make an easy exit from the plane. It's kind of imagination. But if he could not do that, then his anxiety would build up and he had a fear of, well, that he would want to exit, that actually the urge to escape would be so great that he'd have to get up and he'd lose control because of the urge to escape. But somehow he was reassured when he sat in the aisle in the first row. So that's another.
That's what we call a safety behavior. A safety behavior.
Right.
His coping strategy to try to reduce his anxiety.
That's right, and it did not really work.
Yeah, because it prevented him from finding out that didn't matter how bad his anxiety got, he wasn't going to lose control.
Yeah, that's correct.
So that avoidance, right, can get in the way of you getting better because you never find out you can handle it. And that's one of the things you do in therapy is get the person to realize they can handle it. So for example, CBT for panic might include essentially trying to induce a panic attack in session. Well, the therapist is right there to help talk you through it. So you have people breathe through a straw, spin around in a chair, run up and down steps to try to induce some of those symptoms and realize they can live through it. So the next thing we're going to talk about is agoraphobia, which is sometimes associated with panic disorder. And agoraphobia literally translates to fear of the marketplace. It's the fear of being in public, so the individual doesn't want to leave the house. So they have marked, disproportionate, and immediate fear about being in at least two of the following situations: public transit, open spaces, shops, theaters, cinemas, lines or crowds, or being outside their house alone. So you can see for some people with agoraphobia, it becomes very constricting. Their world becomes their house. Fear of agoraphobic situation is related to concern that escape might be hard or help unavailable if they were to experience panic. So that's what you just heard Erin and Judy Beck talking about, right? Or become incapacitated. So in addition to people with panic, we'll also see people with certain medical conditions develop agoraphobia, epilepsy, fear of having a seizure in public, things like Crohn's disease or irritable bowel syndrome, where you're afraid that you might have a diarrhea incident in public. So they'll avoid all situations that they worry about. So all agoraphobic situations, it might become all situations outside their house, and symptoms typically last 6 or more months, and there's significant distress or impairment. So again, most of the time, agoraphobia develops because people have had a panic attack or other related medical attack in a public situation, which leads them to becoming anxious about being in public situations where they could not escape and being embarrassed for making a scene in public if they were to have another panic attack in front of people. People with agoraphobia also show a great deal of what they call interoceptive avoidance. And this is when people are frightened by their own bodily sensations and avoid any activities that will cause arousal. The same things I just talked about for panic disorder: exercise, watching scary movies, drinking caffeine, engaging in sexual activity. Agoraphobia also, again, can occur in people without panic. It's a little more rare. Note that you used to only be able to diagnose agoraphobia in the context of panic, but now since DSM-5, it's diagnosed irrespective of the presence of panic disorder. So if you meet criteria for both, if you are showing agoraphobic symptoms and you have repeated panic attacks, you'd be diagnosed with both. It's believed to happen when aspects of the environment begin to elicit fear, and this fear spreads to all or many environmental situations. And again, I mentioned medical conditions with epilepsy, colitis, where someone will become physically incapacitated.
An estimated 2.5 million adults in this country suffer from an anxiety disorder known as agoraphobia. Now, it causes people to stay home to avoid situations that could trigger a panic attack, like traveling. Our lead national correspondent, David Begnaud, is with us now to share one man's remarkable journey as he takes huge steps to overcome his agoraphobia. David, you don't use the word remarkable very often.
You know how I found this story? You know how you always say to me, David, I don't know where you find this story.
How did you find it? Yeah.
Y'all know.
That does sound like Gil.
People at home are going, yeah, we know.
Yes.
This story came to us. 2 months ago, we did a story about a news anchor in New Orleans who left her job for a major life change. And in that story, she said something which inspired a Houston, Texas man to write to us. He said that his agoraphobia had him colorfully living, but silently suffering. And after 6 years of therapy, the last 2 of which have been really intense, he said, David, I am finally ready to confront some of my biggest fears.
Hi, David. I watched your segment with Karen Swinson. I am inspired. What struck me most was when she spoke about her husband's cancer diagnosis. Quote, when he was diagnosed,
we looked for the person who beat it. When he passed, I looked for the widow who was still smiling.
That was so powerful. I'm a 35-year-old Houstonian and I suffer from agoraphobia. I seemingly lead a normal life as a local store manager, but no one knows that I haven't traveled beyond a 1-mile radius from my home in over 10 years. My childhood was extremely limited due to my mother suffering with agoraphobia, and my adult years have been no different since my diagnosis at the age of 19.
You just read that on national television. How does that feel?
It feels freeing.
Finish the sentence for me. For me, agoraphobia is?
For me, agoraphobia is prison. The best way that I can describe it is feeling like I'm living in a glass box. Like there are walls and boundaries that I cannot get past. And if I attempt to, or when I do, I literally feel as though I'm going to die.
You work across the street from your house.
I do.
You eat across the street.
I do.
Tell me some of the things you've missed.
All of my sister's graduations, my niece's graduation, tons of birthday celebrations, 2 grandmothers' funerals, my sister's wedding. She sends me an email right as she's about to walk down the aisle. In the email, she said, I know that you would be here. I'm sorry, I haven't talked about this.
Cecil found an online lecture from Dr. Karen Cassidy, the owner of the Chicago-based Anxiety Treatment Center. This year, he emailed her.
While I have never met you, it became clear that you understand some of the challenges that many of us face. I want to reclaim my life.
Dr. Cassidy arranged for a Houston therapist to treat Cecil with online sessions.
You have given us a list of things that you would like to do.
Absolutely.
Not things that we've asked you or pressured you to do.
Correct.
But he was not prepared for what we had up our sleeve, meeting Dr. Cassidy for the first time in person.
You are the bravest man I know right now. I've been so excited to see you. I'm going to be your exposure coach today when you're practicing.
She flew to Houston at our invitation to guide him on this big day.
Tell her what you'd like to do.
So, I'd like to go to my therapist's office. I'd like to ride an escalator.
Yeah.
I'd like to go to the grocery store.
Part of Dr. Cassidy's therapy would be to provoke Cecil's anxiety by intentionally hyperventilating. That this is done to get him used to the sensation of panic and learn that he can handle it and teach his body to not respond with panic attacks.
So my goal isn't to make this easy.
Okay.
It's to step into the heat.
Okay.
And to discover you can take it, okay?
I'm willing to do difficult things.
So where's the first place we're going, Cecil?
So the first place we're going to go is to the mall. We're going to ride an escalator.
He was last on an escalator 4 years ago.
So let's do it.
He'd rely on exercises to induce dizziness in order to push through.
Fantastic. You are acing this.
What did you feel?
The sweaty palms, the dizziness, the sensitivity to light. I think I stood there for like 3 minutes talking to her, or 2 minutes talking to her, and it just subsided.
Next up was the grocery store. Now, Cecil hadn't been to one of those in 3 years.
He is doing so well.
It's amazing. It's amazing to be here.
Lines overwhelm him. Even the smallest purchase was a big accomplishment.
Yes, 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 yes.
Cecil was telling us earlier how some people will look at him and think, I don't see anything wrong with him. He looks totally fine. And I, in the store, had that moment where I was like, are you sure you're nervous? Because you look totally fine.
Yeah, and that is so typical. What we see is that when people have a panic attack, usually they're the only one who notices. And unless you know someone well and you know there's a tell, like they get still or quiet, you wouldn't know it.
This is okay. The next one is the real
biggie. Yeah.
Right.
That's the therapist's office?
Right.
If he can get to his therapist's office, that means he could have future appointments in person.
So you ready to hyperventilate? Okay, 1, 2, 3. And just keep doing it.
This is what I was telling you about, where they'll purposely induce symptoms like panic to teach them you can handle this, you can survive, even if you had a full-blown panic attack. If you allow them to engage in those safety behaviors and not experience the anxiety, they don't learn they can handle it. And so, like she said, she's not trying to be mean, but she's pushing him so that he knows he can do it. She's trying to give him a sense of mastery.
Until you feel weird, and then we'll start the car. Keep going. Really exhale hard until you get really weird feeling. Okay, so what's your anxiety level right
10.
now? Yeah, how are you doing right now?
I am. It's actually coming down pretty quickly.
Okay, that tells me something really good, which is your body's already starting to lose its automatic oh no reaction.
5 minutes later, he arrived at the therapist's office and wanted to go inside and even say hello. The next day, he went back by himself.
My prayer has been to be seen. To be seen. To be seen. Oh, yeah. I think that sometimes when you suffer, you feel like nobody sees you. When you deal with agoraphobia, people write you off, and you're often hidden in the shadows.
We see you, Cecil. We see you.
Thank you.
Just like makes my heart happy to see someone
An
who's been
estimated
so
two-
restricted getting to experience their lives. So what are the biological causes? Panic attacks are believed to have a genetic component, maybe 33 to 44%, somewhere in that range. They're also thought to possibly result from biochemical abnormalities. So the noradrenaline system is believed to stimulate activity associated with panic, like that racing heart, shortness of breath, what they were trying to induce right there, basically. But the serotonergic system, serotonin, is believed to decrease that activity. And they tested this by treating people with panic disorder using SSRIs, which increased that rate of serotonin. The stimulation of the serotonergic system showed to decrease activity in the noradrenaline system, thus limiting the symptoms of panic. So SSRIs also helpful here. In terms of panic, it also seems to be related to brain functioning, particularly the amygdala. It's a collection of nuclei in the brain that's involved in the emotion of fear in particular. And this is the primary player in the panic response. So when threatening information is detected, again, whether that's outside yourself or inside yourself, it enters the prefrontal cortex, which activates the amygdala, which stimulates this fear response. And so what we think is that in folks with panic disorder, they have abnormally sensitive, these fear networks. Maybe the amygdala itself is abnormally sensitive. And I thought it was so interesting that his mom had agoraphobia as well, right? So we see that genetic component, but also, as he sort of mentioned, the social component. If you learn growing up that the only place that's safe is close into home, right? It's hard to break out of that. Medication, obviously the SSRIs, but anything that's going to target the serotonergic and noradrenaline system, also GABA systems as well. And again, you need the skills, right? So medicines will help you a little bit, but what you really need are the type of skills that she was teaching him in the video, and it sounded like he'd been working on with his therapist. Now, in terms of the cognitive perspective, there's this fear of fear hypothesis related to panic. Eventually, the worry about a panic attack, and this is true of panic disorder in particular, makes a future panic attack more likely. Because when you're worrying a lot, you get some of those same symptoms physiologically that can activate the neuroadrenic system, activate a panic attack. And then safety behaviors just keep it up because you never learn you can handle it. You're always on edge even when you're using your safety behaviors. We also know there are cognitive biases inherent here where people will believe I'm going to have a panic attack and that's going to be the end of the world, right? And that can lead to that agoraphobia. And they have this perception that I'm in control, I'm safe, when obviously the anxiety is actually controlling them. So this is an illustration of that cognitive model, that there's some sort of trigger or stimulus, again, it could be internal sensations or external things. That's a perceived threat. This will activate worry, that will activate those bodily sensations, and then you'll interpret those sensations as a heart attack, a panic attack, what have you, and then it becomes this really vicious cycle. Now, cognitive therapy, as I mentioned, the first thing you do is psychoeducation to educate clients about all the stuff I'm telling you all about what panic is. And then you teach clients to apply more accurate interpretations of their bodily sensations or of their triggers. And the most important part is to teach them skills for coping with their anxiety. Relaxation techniques, deep breathing techniques. Nowadays, it's a lot of mindfulness meditation as well. And again, you can use biological challenge behavior or sensations strategies. Like you saw there, let's breathe until it feels like you're hyperventilating. Let's jump up and down. Let's run up and down a flight of stairs. Let's breathe through a tube. And then you practice those coping strategies and making more accurate interpretations of those sensations. Cognitive therapy is often helpful. 85% of treated patients are panic-free after 2 years, as opposed to 13% of control subjects. However, it's less helpful for agoraphobia. Again, you need to do more specialized exposures at that point in time, as you saw in the video. Cognitive therapy is at least as helpful as SSRIs to treat panic. And again, combination therapy might be the most effective. Although some people worry in particular with this one about if you dull the feelings of panic, can the person really truly learn to master them? All right, so next we're going to move on to OCD. And so as you see here on the slide, once upon a time, this was an anxiety disorder, really till of 2013. And now there is a separate category of disorders in the DSM-5 called obsessive compulsive and related disorders. The other disorders that are included are body dysmorphic disorder. And so this is obsession with something being wrong about your appearance. We're going to cover this when we talk about disorders related to bodily sensations and health. Hoarding. If anyone's ever seen the TV show Hoarders. Okay, that. The trichotillomania we talked about early in the semester, the pulling out your hair when you're anxious. And then excoriation is very similar to trichotillomania. Instead of pulling your hair, you do skin picking. Okay. So the reason that they changed this in the DSM-5, this is a direct quote, it reflects the increasing evidence of these disorders relatedness to one another, both in terms of symptoms and treatments, and also their distinction from pure anxiety disorders. So obsessions and compulsions are the two key components, not surprisingly, in something called obsessive compulsive disorder, right? Obsessions are persistent and recurrent intrusive thoughts, images, or impulses. Persistent and recurrent intrusive thoughts, images, or impulses. And these are disturbing, and sometimes inappropriate. Compulsions are the thoughts or actions the person will engage in to suppress the obsessions and provide relief. So the thoughts or actions to suppress the thoughts and provide relief. And we tend to think of compulsions as overt things like hand washing or checking, but they can also be covert mental acts like counting things. And so this is a video about a teenager with severe OCD.
When you get to the mirror and start doing and redoing and redoing to the point that you can't leave the house and miss life, then it's a debilitating issue.
The longest it ever took me to do my hair was 4 hours. My spike would be like, it wasn't perfect. And like that spot, it looks weird. Over here, like my sideburns look weird. And everyone's gonna laugh at me. You can't see OCD. So it really gets to me when people say like, well, I don't see you anxious. I don't see you depressed. I don't see you doing things multiple times. It's not always very obvious. Most of the time, it's really secretive.
It's frightening to watch sometimes, depending on the compulsions, and you want to make it stop, just stop. Because as a parent, you want to fix things, and you can't fix this.
I'm Allison, I'm 14 years old, and I live with OCD. So this is my room, and I have all my stuff here. Eeyore was always my favorite character in Winnie the Pooh, because I'm like the glass half empty kind of person, so I just felt like I understood him more, rather than the other ones, which were just like silly characters. And it feels like someone gets me. I first realized I had OCD in 3rd grade. I would rewrite and reread, retalk. I knew it wasn't normal because no one else was doing it, but I just felt like it had to be done. So a normal day, I would say at least 3 hours are spent being anxious or doing compulsions in my head. A compulsion is a behavior that you do either mentally or physically to relieve the anxiety from the obsession or intrusive thought. Most of my compulsions are like pure O, which means it's mental compulsions. So instead of tapping the wall 10 times, I count in my head 10 times. And no one sees it, but it's definitely still there. The most I've ever done compulsions were like a day and a half without stopping. I was in 4th grade and my rewriting OCD got really bad, so I couldn't write without rewriting at least 10 times each word. I would write something and erase it and write and erase, and it would get me really anxious, and then I would rip through the paper and I would just like hide in the bathroom, try to like not be at school, and I would try to take as much sick days as I can off. My mom tried to explain to that teacher about OCD like multiple times, and my teacher just made everything worse. She would rip up my paper, she would throw it away.
Her teacher at the time wasn't really aware of what OCD was, so she would address it by saying things like, you just need practice in writing.
At the same time, I was getting made fun of for my OCD because I was rewriting so much. Everyone knew that, and everyone knew me as a person who rewrites. Then I remember this boy was rewriting a sentence because he messed up, and all the kids were like, oh, you got the Allison disease. I tried to play it off as a joke. I'm like, yeah, haha, yeah, but when I got home, I was crying to my mom because I don't want to be known as that. I don't want to be known as the weird person. All my friends, they're in a regular school. They might fail a few tests, but they're okay with it. And for me, it's like I have to be in a special school with teachers that help me 24/7, and it kind of makes me feel like I'm not independent, and I can never do anything by myself.
So the general idea, what was the whole book about?
So that gives you a little bit of indication of how much it can take over your life, the amount of time you spend engaging in these compulsions, 4 hours just to get her hair the way she thought she needed it. right? These are really debilitating. The next video is the author John Green, who's very open about his own struggle with OCD. His book Turtles All the Way Down, the character is loosely based on himself and his own experiences. So this is him talking about that.
Good morning, Hank. It's Tuesday. This video is about my mental health, but I want to say here at the outset that I am not a psychologist, and that in general, I think we should listen to experts when it comes to mental health and also when it comes to other things. But I can only speak to my personal experience. Okay, so it seems to me that the...
So one thing I'll say is that, yes, we should listen to experts with mental health issues, but we should also listen to the people who are living the experience. One of the things I really love about a conference I got to attend several times remotely during the pandemic, the International Conference on Eating Disorders, is that they do a lot of having people with lived experience as speakers. And so it might be someone who themselves had an eating disorder, or like a parent, a caregiver. And it's so much more powerful, and it's something like clinicians and researchers need to hear, right? So that's why I showed you all these videos of people's lived experiences, because it explains it so much better than someone sort of standing there dryly, right, talking about the theory.
The stuff happening way down inside of us is difficult to talk about, partly because those experiences aren't really accessible by the senses. You can't usually see or hear psychic pain, and it's difficult to describe without simile or metaphor. Like, I might say that it feels like there's a void inside of me, or like my insides are twisted, or like my brain is on fire. I can say what it's like more than I can say what it is. So I have obsessive compulsive disorder, which is mostly seen in the popular imagination as being about like excessive hand washing or neatness or whatever, because those are things you can see, you know? They're not like the formless, insensate horrors of psychic pain. They're behaviors that you can like portray in a movie. But for me at least, there's a reason the obsessive comes before the compulsive in the name. So I experience these obsessive thought spirals in which intrusive thoughts, that is like thoughts that I don't want to have, that seem to come from outside of me, sort of hijack my consciousness. Now everyone has known some version of not being able to choose their thoughts. Like after you lose someone, you may find yourself thinking about them all the time. You may see a sunset and think about seeing a sunset with that person, or you open a car door and remember driving with them, etc. But for me, these obsessive thought spirals happen all the time, and they can take over for days or weeks or months. Like I might worry out of nowhere that my food is contaminated or somehow poisoned, and then suddenly that will be the only thought I'm able to think, the thought I'm either thinking or distracting myself from all the time. And when that gets bad, I can lose all control over my thoughts for an extended period of time, to the extent that I can't follow what's happening in a TV show or read a book. This is exhausting, of course, but it's also kind of terrifying because one, I can't stop being scared of the thing I'm scared about. And two, if I can't choose my thoughts and I am at least in part made out of those thoughts, then am I actually the captain of this ship I call myself? And the more you think about that, at least for me, the more it becomes sort of the premise for a horror movie. Right, so the compulsive behaviors I use to cope with these obsessive thought spirals, repeatedly checking my food for contamination, for instance, or spending hours Googling what will happen to me if I eat moldy bread, those are for me ways of trying to comfort and calm myself. Like, I'm not checking over and over again to be eccentric or whatever, I'm doing it because I cannot stop obsessing over the fear that I might have eaten living mold, and I will do whatever I can not to be strangled by that thought. Mental illness is highly stigmatized in our culture, but it is also sometimes romanticized. We see TV shows where in order to catch a terrorist, a mentally ill person must go off their meds, or we see obsessive detectives whose obsessiveness allows them to crack cases that others couldn't. That kind of thing might be true to some people's experiences, but it hasn't been true to mine. Like, I don't feel like my mental illness has any superpower side effects. In fact, when I'm stuck inside a thought spiral, I find it very difficult to observe like anything outside of myself. I become a terrible detective. So when I started the book that has become Turtles All the Way Down, I wanted to like try to find form and expression for this way down, non-sensorial experience of living inside of thought spirals. The book is fictional, totally fictional, but it began for me with thinking about what it would be like to be this one particular 16-year-old girl, Asa Holmes, who's trying to be a good daughter and a good friend and a good student and maybe even a good detective, while also living with terrifying thought spirals that she cannot see or hear, but that are nonetheless very real. So like that's a bit of an introduction to the story and how I came to write it. I also want to say to anyone out there concerned about their mental health, please seek help. I've put some resources in the doobly-doo below. I know it can be difficult to get effective treatment, but there is hope, even if your brain tells you there isn't. The vast majority of mental illness is treatable, and lots of people with chronic mental health problems have fulfilling and vibrant lives. Hank, DFT.
So I just think it's really good to see and hear from people what living with OCD is like, because I think those of us who haven't had that experience, unfortunately, particularly OCD has sort of become a joke in our society. Like, oh, I'm having an OCD moment, or, oh, that's so OCD of you, right? And in fact, it's not, right? Because this is a very specific disease that really takes hold of people's lives and keeps them in an entrapment, a prison, right, of what's going on. And so the obsessions can feel foreign. They can feel like someone else put them inside your brain. And if you just try to blow them off or ignore them, anxiety city. And they can take all these different forms: wishes, impulses, images, ideas, doubts. And they have common themes. You heard John Green talking about, worried about contamination in his food, violence and aggression, orderliness, religion, or sexuality. And so one of the most famous folks who had OCD was portrayed, again, very Hollywood-esque, as John Green talked about in the movie The Aviator, was Howard Hughes. And his OCD got so bad that at the end of his life, he locked himself in a room in his home. Now, compulsions themselves, as you heard from these two individuals with their lived experiences, are quote unquote voluntary. That doesn't mean that you're actually choosing to do them. Like, they feel like they have no choice. They feel like these are mandatory. They feel like they're unstoppable. And the person may and often does recognize that these behaviors are irrational, but they believe that catastrophe will occur if they don't perform these compulsive acts. Performing these compulsive acts does reduce anxiety, but only for a short period of time, which is why they engage in them over and over and over again. And these behaviors can develop into rituals that themselves become safety behaviors. Oops, that was new. So these are some of the types of compulsions you'll see: cleaning. Again, we stereotypically think of washing your hands over and over. Checking is one people don't necessarily think of as much, but they will repeatedly check, like, did I leave the oven on? Turn lights on and off, things along those lines. Repeating things over and over, just until they feel right, look right, like this young girl with her hair. Ordering and arranging things in certain ways, and counting. So I had a friend in college that, until he disclosed with me, I had no idea that he had OCD. And one of his compulsions is our campus, like this campus, was tree lined, and he had to count his steps between each tree mentally. And if the steps weren't right, he would like back up and do it again. So like only 1 or 2 steps. And I think the way he passed this off is the way I knew him, is we were both members of the ballroom dance club. And so I think if anyone asked him, he was like, oh, I'm practicing my steps, right? But like, little did people know, this was actually sort of like this prison of his own making. And he wasn't doing that great. So obsessive compulsive disorder, you've got recurrent obsessions, compulsions, or both.
Yeah. What about people who are like obsessively like have when they like when they have to do something in order to like continue, like I know like for some havers when I have to do it, I don't do them in my head constantly. So is that like similar?
It can be, yeah. Even superstitions can be like, so like if you ever watch a Major League Baseball game, right? Like the pitcher will go through a whole bunch of different things before he throws the ball, and the batter will go through a whole bunch of different things before he goes to hit, right? Like, got to tap my shoe twice with my bat, do this, that, and the other. And they've actually this season instituted the pitching clock to try to cut down on some of that, right? But yeah, that those behaviors, even though they wouldn't be diagnosable as OCD, they can feel like that for sure. Yeah, that's such a good question. Yeah, and one thing I should say here is that we think of having both, but sometimes it's really more the obsessions. So I'll give you like the saddest story of OCD that I've ever known. So I treated a client, wonderful woman, probably about the age I am now, in her 40s. Had 2 kiddos, I think, might be 1. So it's been a while since I treated her. Kind of doesn't matter. But she herself had been sexually abused as a child. And so her obsession was that she was going to abuse her own children, even though she never had and she never would, because she herself was abused. But to the point that like her husband had to give her kids their baths because she thought like that was not okay or inappropriate. If her daughter sat down and her skirt flipped up, as little girl skirts often do, she would think that she had done something wrong. It was, she beat herself up, and it was really, oh, it was so hard just to hear her talk about that. Yeah, so it can really be these things that we just like get stuck on and can't break, right? And yeah, I mean, for a lot of these disorders, it's sort of like, where do you cross the line to becoming disordered, and when is it just a superstition, right? Or something with anxiety, right? Like, where do you cross the line from like everybody gets anxious to like this is something that's interfering with your life, right? And sometimes it depends on the situation. Like, I myself have never been diagnosed with it, but I think I probably have high functioning GAD. I generally go through life just fine, but if I'm in a very stressful situation, I kind of can't cope. When I was waiting to see whether I matched for internship, which you have to do in order to get your PhD, I couldn't eat for like a week before. I was just eating like pasta with a little bit of butter on it and not eating much of that, right? So I think that, yeah, there's a spectrum and we don't always recognize that. And it's important to. And that these obsessions or compulsions are going to be time consuming. Again, 4 hours to do your hair, right? And not for a special event, just to go to school. Or cause clinically significant distress or impairment. And again, for a lot of folks, it will. So the idea here is that you have the obsessions, those cause anxiety. So then you do the compulsions and they grant temporary relief, but only temporary, and then you get those compulsions, obsessions again, and you have to do the compulsions again. Some people with like the contamination obsessions will engage in the compulsion of washing their hands so often that their hands will actually like bleed because they're so raw. Okay, so again, just like any other disorder, there's a spectrum of how severe it is as well. So in terms of explaining OCD, we've got all kinds of fun ways of describing it. I'm sorry, like psychodynamic always sort of boggles me a little bit. That's all right. So this is, you're stuck in the anal stage. So that you have now feared your id impulses and you use ego defenses to lessen your anxiety, and that the battle is not unconscious. It's played out in explicit thought and action. And the idea that these id impulses are the obsessive thoughts and the ego defenses are the compulsive actions, the counter thoughts. At its core, OCD is related to aggressive impulses and competing need to control them. That one feels especially weird to me. Again, having worked with someone who there was not an aggressive bone in her body, right? And the battle between the id and the ego, that there are these 3 ego defense mechanisms in OCD. So isolation, disowning your own disturbing thoughts, feeling like someone else placed them in your head. And this is something that people with OCD talk about. They feel like, I don't even know where these thoughts come from, where these obsessions come from. Undoing, so performing the compulsions to cancel out those thoughts. And then reaction formation can be taking on a lifestyle in contrast to those unacceptable impulses. So my client, being overly cautious so that she didn't abuse her children, even though she had no desire to ever do that. And the idea was that there's this intense conflict between the id and the ego, and that's particularly centered at the anal stage, but not even all psychodynamic theorists agree on this. So again, you'll hear the skepticism in my voice for some of these. The behavioral perspective, point to learned behaviors, the compulsions being reinforced by the belief that some thoughts are dangerous or unacceptable and need to be reduced. So what you do in purely behavioral therapy is you treat the compulsions rather than the obsessions. So the idea is that these are probably learned by chance, and people who happen upon compulsions randomly So like in a fearful situation, they happen to wash their hands and that makes them feel better. And when the threat lifts, they'll associate the improvements in their own anxiety with having done the act of the compulsion. After repeated associations, they believe the compulsion is actually changing the situation. When we think about that cycle we just looked at, maybe temporarily, right? But not really. And then it's sort of bringing luck, warding away evil, etc. And the act itself becomes a key method of avoiding or reducing anxiety. Now, really interesting, again, tying this to what we were just talking about with superstition, this makes me think about Skinner did some purely behavioral studies on superstitious behavior in pigeons. So he had this little timer set to give the pigeons food randomly. And the pigeons were sort of trained to know like they'd be rewarded for a behavior, right? So whatever behavior they were doing when the food first came, they kept doing it, no matter how long it took to get the food again. So if the pigeon was spinning in a circle, they'd keep spinning in a circle. If the pigeon had been bobbing their head up and down, they'd bob their head up and down, right? And again, this makes me think of athletes, artists, performers, and how they develop these. Like, you know, Olympic gold medalist Suni Lee. She now is competing for Auburn in NCAA gymnastics. She probably doesn't need any help with anything, right? She's doing pretty well. But the first time she got a perfect 10 on beam, she ate pickles beforehand. So now she always has to eat pickles before she goes on beam, right? Like little things like that getting reinforced. Now, behavioral therapy here involves exposure and response prevention. So you expose the client to situations that elicit their compulsion, and then you don't allow them to do the compulsions. So the simplest example of this is, let's say someone has a contamination compulsion or obsession and their compulsion is washing their hands. You take something that isn't actually going to hurt them, like peanut butter, especially if they're not allergic, right? We check that first. You put a little dab on their hands and you make them sit there. And the modeling is often you as the therapists do it too. Tend to be pretty high achieving people, have some perfectionistic tendencies. So sometimes this is hard for the therapist too, right? But you together learn that you can sit and it's not actually going to harm you if you don't wash your hands right away. Clients are repeatedly exposed to these anxiety-provoking stimuli and prevented from responding with their compulsions. Homework is a really important component where you have them practice it outside of therapy. Okay, go home and sit at your kitchen table for a minute with peanut butter on your hand. And maybe next week we do 5 minutes, all right? We build it up. Treatment can be in individual or group settings, and it provides a significant long-lasting improvement for most patients. However, that's for 75% of patients. So 25% of patients don't improve, and the approach is limited to help those who have obsessions but no compulsions. And this is why we develop other types of therapy. So the cognitive perspective is one of the perspectives that tries to address it in a slightly different way. So cognitive theory begins by pointing out that everyone has repetitive, unwanted, and intrusive thoughts, right? All of us will think about something and we'll be like, why am I thinking about, you know, what I had for lunch 2 years ago? Or the movie Inside Out, how she keeps hearing the gum jingle over and over, right? Like we get stupid things like that stuck in our heads. But that people with OCD will blame themselves for that, and that becomes part of the problem. And they expect that terrible things will happen as a result, whereas most of us will just get annoyed, right? Oh, the stupid jingle. So then they'll overreact to those unwanted thoughts. To avoid such negative outcomes, they try to neutralize their thoughts with those actions or other thoughts. And they do this by seeking reassurance, trying to think good thoughts, washing, checking, etc. And when that neutralizing action reduces anxiety, we've got negative reinforcement. We've gotten rid of something we don't want. And so that's going to be reinforcing and keep you engaging in that compulsion. So then the thought becomes, so if everyone has intrusive thoughts, why do only some people develop OCD? People that do have OCD tend to be more likely to have depression than others. So we saw that with the 14-year-old girl I mean, just the fact that she was like, I always related the most to Eeyore. I mean, like in my mind, Eeyore is sort of like the embodiment of depression, poor guy, right? But I also love that like a children's book and cartoon has a character with depression and his friends don't love him less, right? They're always trying to engage him. To have higher standards of morality and conduct, so they get down on themselves more if they slip, quote unquote. They tend to believe that their thoughts are equal to actions and capable of bringing harm. Again, I think of my client here who was thinking she would abuse her children. And to believe they can and should have perfect control over their thoughts and behaviors. So in cognitive therapy, you would focus on those thoughts and the cognitive processes that produce and maintain those thoughts and actions. And you might do psychoeducation about what OCD is, what those obsessions are, what the compulsions are. And habituation training, where you just get them used to. Let's do this. Let's, wash your hands until you're sick of it, right? And see what happens then. But the most common therapy right now for OCD is to combine the cognitive and behavioral approaches. So attacking sounds wrong, but I guess we certainly are, addressing the obsessions, but also those behavioral compulsions. So the treatments typically include psychoeducation as well as exposure and response prevention exercises. That being said, I don't have a slide for this, but the treatment I used for my particular client, there wasn't anything I could have done exposure and response prevention with, right? She wasn't engaging in a behavioral act. And so I use what's called a third wave cognitive therapy. And these tend to include mindfulness and acceptance. And so the type of therapy I used was called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. It's not ACT, it's ACT. I learned that in grad school when I was told off by an ACT practitioner. My bad. But for her, it was about accepting that a thought is just a thought. And if you think about abusing your child, it doesn't mean you will abuse your child. And in her case, it actually meant she was less likely to abuse her child, right? And just sort of recognizing that sometimes we have really awful thoughts, but they don't mean that we're really awful people. And that's the main philosophy behind ACT, although it certainly gets more nuanced and focuses in on like, what do we value in life? What do we want to emphasize in life? All right, so this is a video showing exposure and response prevention. Okay. Didn't really need a
Hi, Fiona. Welcome. Thanks for giving us an opportunity to talk generally about exposure and response prevention. Maybe we could just kick off with some basic definitions of what these actually are. So if we could take the exposure bit first of all, how do we define that?
Okay, so a lot of the clients that we work with have got problems which are maintained by an avoidance cycle. So they get into a bad place, they feel awful, they do something.
There's an actual demo, that's what I'm trying to get to. I'll go back a few seconds so you can see his backstory. There we go. So this is a client with OCD problems that manifests as a desire for symmetry. Everything has to be straightened. And he has an unspecified fear of something bad or catastrophic happening if he doesn't check or straighten those things.
So hi Cole, nice to see you
nice
again.
To see you again.
I'm so glad you made it. Fantastic. So last session we talked a little bit about the problem that you're struggling with at the moment.
Yeah.
And we collected some questionnaires from you and we talked a little bit about your background, etc. And we came to the conclusion that what you're suffering from would be best called OCD, obsessional compulsive disorder. So was that news to you or had you heard that before?
You didn't
really like surprised me, to be honest. I think in my head, you know, it could be, you know, like something worse. So I'm happy kind of for that, but it's.
Okay, so what kind of thing did you think it might be? Hi, Cole. Hi, nice to see you.
Nice to see you again.
This is our third meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And you're still turning up wonderfully on time, and it's great to
Do
see.
try, yeah.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Okay. So, last time you've been kind of just observing this need to arrange books, magazines, paperwork.
With Marie, she just.
Okay. All right.
Even I realize because that we've you know diagnosed, like that's the problem. It's like with being me, it's not like Marie. So if there's like a book, you know, lying around, instead of me like coming to myself saying like, can you move it, or oh, I need to move it. If she just leaves it there, she just leaves it there, but not like always on purpose. You just like just do what you do, you know, and I'll deal with it.
And it's going to be scary. It's going to be difficult, you know. But I guess what I'd like you to hold in mind is why you would do that. So why is it important for you to get out of this? And you want to be a good dad, I'm guessing.
Yes.
Okay. So this is why you might be willing.
So this is where they're like looking at his cycle and what his motivations are and why. She's trying to essentially like pump him up and say like, yeah, this is going to be hard, but here's why you're doing it.
To do some difficult work. Is that correct? Because they're big deals, aren't they?
Yeah.
They're very important things, and they're things I'd want in my life. Well, obviously I couldn't be a good dad, but I'd like to be a good, I should say dad. That's a Freudian slip. I put bad.
Good bad.
Good bad. We're going to do it like an experiment, but we're going to do it like, because I've done this lots of times before, so I kind of know how it works, and I'm asking you just to be willing and open to try it.
Okay.
I really like this because it shows that you don't just dive into it, right? You spend a lot of time setting it up so the client will engage with it.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Let's go. I have some books here.
So she's putting out the books in such a way that he would normally feel that he has to straighten them. And then what they would do would be to sit there and not allow him to straighten them. So, we're gonna, well, this one's pretty short. We'll do this one real quick.
What are some easy ways I can start overcoming my OCD obsession?
So this is gonna talk more about that acceptance component I talked about that I used with my client.
First, accept that obsessions and compulsions aren't the only way to reduce your anxiety. Well, yeah, that's why I'm here. What I want you to do next is come to terms with the obsessive thought. Know that it's a part of your OCD, it's a symptom of it, and instead of playing tug of war with that obsession, just sort of let it be. Easier said than done, Dr. Ali. You can then postpone the obsession, pick a time and place in the future, and then revisit the obsession then. What if I can't do that? Change the way you obsess. Find a way to corrupt the rules of OCD. Maybe you can write down the obsession, or you can sing it out loud, or if it's an image in your head, you can change something drastic about it. What if I want to push things even further? Write down your obsession, record yourself saying it into your voice memo app, and then listen to it on repeat, growing the amount of time you're able to hear it until you reach about 45 minutes every day.
So again,
what
different type of exposure, honestly. All right, so real quick in the last 2 minutes we have, the biological perspective. It seems like there is a moderate genetic contribution. There's a 53% concordance rate in identical twins versus 23% in fraternal twins. Seems like there's some abnormalities in brain structure and functioning we're discovering. So in particular, PET scans show hyperactivity in various regions of the brain, and that serotonin is probably implicated in that. We see high levels of serotonin in OCD. So the brain structures may be hypersensitive to serotonin. And so we can medicate OCD. Biological treatment involves drugs that increase brain serotonin activity, like Prozac. SSRIs do benefit up to 60% of patients. You can do psychosurgery in extreme cases. And relapse, just like with all the other anxiety disorders, is common if you only do medication. You really need to do therapy to learn the skills. And then this is just an overall model of how everything plays into the anxiety disorders. Alrighty, so that is our whirlwind tour of all the anxiety disorders. And on Thursday, we're going to start talking about stress-related disorders, particularly focusing on PTSD.